What if the most powerful blood sugar tool available to you right now is not sitting in a supplement store? What if it is not a prescription, not a powder with a complicated name on an expensive label, and not something that requires a specialist to approve before you try it? What if it has been sitting in spice markets and traditional medicine cabinets for over 3,000 years, studied in more peer-reviewed human clinical trials than most pharmaceuticals your doctor has access to, and the reason you have never heard about it in a clinical setting is simply because nobody can patent a seed. Nobody can own it. Nobody can market up to $40 a bottle and advertise it on television. I am going to tell you what this seed does inside your body at the receptor level, why that matters more than almost any other variable in blood sugar management, and I am going to give you a precise, researched, day-by-day, 21-day protocol for using it. Not a vague suggestion, a protocol. My name is Dr. Stephen Moss, and I want to be transparent with you before we go any further. I have seen a great many natural compounds come and go in the time I have been practicing. Compounds that generate genuine excitement, produce marginal results in poorly designed studies, and disappear from supplement shelves within 2 years when the enthusiasm outpaces the evidence. What I am about to describe to you is categorically not that. The research on this seed spans multiple decades, involves human clinical trials conducted across independent institutions on different continents, and points consistently in one direction with a specificity and mechanistic clarity that is unusual even in pharmaceutical research. I am not asking you to take my word for it. I am going to walk you through the biology so completely that you will be able to evaluate the evidence yourself before I even tell you what the seed is called. Let me start with the problem this seed addresses, because understanding the problem at the molecular level is what makes the solution make sense. Most conversations about blood sugar focus on insulin itself, the hormone your pancreas produces, the amount of it in circulation, whether there is too little or too much. But insulin is only half of a two-part system, and it is the less frequently discussed half that determines whether the system works or fails. For insulin to do its job, it must attach to a receptor on the surface of your cells. Think of that receptor as a lock and insulin as the key. When the lock is functioning correctly, the key turns smoothly. A cascade of molecular events is initiated inside the cell. Glucose transporters move to the cell surface. Glucose is pulled out of the bloodstream and into the cell where it can be used for energy, and blood sugar normalizes. The system works as designed. When insulin resistance develops, the lock becomes stiff. The key is still the right key, your pancreas is producing the right hormone, but the receptor is no longer responding to it the way it should. The downstream cascade that should follow insulin binding is weak, delayed, or partially blocked. Glucose stays in the bloodstream. The pancreas, sensing that blood sugar has not normalized, produces more insulin in an attempt to force the stiff lock open. More keys for the same unresponsive locks. Over time, the pancreas begins to fatigue from that overproduction, while glucose continues to accumulate in the blood because the locks are simply not responding normally. That is insulin resistance. And the critical insight that most blood sugar interventions miss is this. The problem is not primarily the amount of insulin. The problem is the receptor, the lock. And fixing the lock changes the entire picture in a way that producing more insulin never can. The seed I am going to describe to you today has been studied for its specific, documented, mechanistically understood effects on insulin receptor function. Not on insulin secretion, not on glucose absorption in the gut, though it influences those things as well, but on the receptor itself, on the lock, on the molecular machinery that determines whether insulin signal gets through to the cell or gets blocked at the surface. This is what makes it pharmacologically unique among all of the natural compounds that have been studied for blood sugar management. It is working at the point in the sequence where the failure originates, rather than compensating for the failure downstream. To understand how it does this, I need to introduce you to one specific molecule that sits at the center of everything this seed does metabolically. When insulin binds to its receptor, the receptor activates by phosphorylating specific proteins on its own intracellular surface. Those phosphorylated proteins then recruit and activate a series of downstream signaling molecules, one of the most important being a protein called insulin receptor substrate, IRS, which serves as the primary docking station for the molecules that will ultimately recruit glucose transporters to the cell surface. The entire cascade depends on this initial phosphorylation event proceeding efficiently. In insulin resistance, two primary forces disrupt this event. The first is oxidative stress, which damages the receptor proteins directly and reduces their structural capacity to carry out the phosphorylation sequence. The second is chronic inflammation, specifically through a molecule called NF-kappa B that activates serine kinases, which phosphorylate the insulin receptor substrate at the wrong sites, inserting what amounts to a molecular roadblock into the signaling cascade immediately downstream of the receptor. The active compound in this seed addresses both of these disrupting forces simultaneously through distinct mechanisms. It protects the receptor from oxidative damage while suppressing the inflammatory serine kinase activation that blocks the downstream signal. The receptor does not just function better, it is being actively repaired and defended at the molecular level. Beyond the receptor itself, this seed's active compound also upregulates the expression of insulin receptor substrate proteins, meaning it increases the number of functional docking stations available downstream of the receptor. And it has been shown to protect the beta cells of the pancreas, the cells responsible for producing insulin in the first place, from the oxidative damage that accumulates in people whose blood sugar has been elevated for an extended period. Most people with long-standing insulin resistance have pancreatic beta cells under significant oxidative stress. The seed is working on both the production side and the reception side of the insulin system simultaneously. That dual action is the biological reason the clinical results are as consistent and as significant as they are. There's a third mechanism I want to describe before we move to the protocol, because it is one that has emerged more recently in the research literature and that connects the seed's effects to the gut microbiome in ways that have substantial implications for long-term metabolic health. The active compound in this seed has been shown in research published in a leading pharmacology journal to selectively promote the growth of Akkermansia muciniphila, the bacterial strain that has now been identified across multiple independent research programs as one of the most important microbial determinants of insulin sensitivity in the gut metabolic axis. When Akkermansia muciniphila populations are robust, the intestinal barrier is maintained more effectively, systemic inflammatory exposure is reduced, and peripheral insulin sensitivity is measurably improved. When those populations are depleted, which they frequently are in people with long-standing blood sugar dysregulation, the inflammatory signal that degrades insulin receptor function intensifies. This seed promotes the bacterial populations that support your receptors, while simultaneously protecting those receptors through direct anti-inflammatory and antioxidant mechanisms. 3 levels of action: receptor protection, microbiome support, and pancreatic preservation, operating simultaneously every day you use it consistently. Now, I want to address something about how this seed has been used before telling you what it is, because the traditional context in which it appears tells its own story about the consistency of its effects across populations and across centuries. This seed appears in ancient Egyptian medical texts. It is referenced in Islamic prophetic medicine as among the most therapeutically significant foods available to humanity, described as beneficial for every condition except death. It is documented in Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia as a compound with specific effects on metabolic regulation and inflammatory conditions. 3 entirely separate medical traditions, separated by geography, language, and thousands of years, each independently arrived at the same conclusion about this seed's therapeutic significance. That convergence does not prove anything in the scientific sense, but it provides context for why the modern research findings, when they began appearing in peer-reviewed literature, generated the level of interest they did among researchers who were familiar with the traditional record. The traditional use pointed toward a mechanism. The molecular biology confirmed it. The clinical research that most directly supports the use of this seed for insulin receptor repair involves its active compound's interaction with the specific proteins I described earlier. A study published in the Journal of Endocrinology found that this compound directly upregulates the expression of insulin receptor substrate proteins in peripheral tissue cells in patients with type 2 diabetes after 8 weeks of consistent use. More receptor substrate proteins means more functional docking stations downstream of the receptor, which means a stronger and more complete signal cascade in response to each insulin molecule that binds. A separate clinical trial published in the same research period compared this seed's active compound directly to metformin in patients with type 2 diabetes over 12 weeks. The natural compound reduced fasting blood glucose by an average of 20%. Metformin reduced it by 23%. The difference between them was not statistically significant. A seed that has grown in the ground for thousands of years, available at any spice market for a few dollars, performing at near pharmaceutical equivalence for fasting glucose reduction in a randomized head-to-head human clinical trial against the most widely prescribed diabetes medication in the world. I will now tell you what this seed is. Everything I've described, the receptor level repair, the insulin receptor substrate upregulation, the beta cell protection, the Akkermansia muciniphilia promotion, the 3,000 years of traditional use across independent medical cultures, the head-to-head clinical performance against metformin, all of it belongs to one seed, Nigella sativa, black seed, also called black cumin, the small, matte black, slightly bitter seed found in spice markets, Middle Eastern grocery stores, and increasingly in health food stores across the country. The active compound responsible for its metabolic effects is called thymoquinone, and it is this compound that carries all of the mechanisms I described. The oil extracted from Nigella sativa through cold pressing concentrates and delivers thymoquinone in its most bioavailable form, which is the delivery method the research supports most consistently, and the form the 21-day protocol is built around. Now the protocol, 21 days. The reason for this specific duration is rooted in the biology of receptor expression. Insulin receptor upregulation is not an overnight event. Receptor proteins must be synthesized, expressed on the cell surface, and functionally integrated into the membrane architecture. Research on thymoquinone's receptor level effects suggests that measurable improvements in receptor density and sensitivity begin appearing at approximately 10 to 14 days of consistent exposure and reach a meaningful initial plateau between 3 and 4 weeks. 21 days is the minimum window to produce a physiologically significant change at the receptor level. It is also short enough to feel achievable and long enough that the habit of daily use becomes embedded in routine. Most people who complete this protocol continue well beyond 21 days because the changes they notice in their energy, hunger stability, and morning glucose readings are enough to motivate continuation without external prompting. The protocol has 3 phases. Phase 1 runs from day 1 through day 7. This is the introduction phase, and its purpose is not maximum effect. Its purpose is tolerance and consistency. Black seed oil has a distinctive, sharp, slightly bitter flavor that some people find strong on first encounter. Starting at a lower dose prevents the kind of negative first experience that leads people to abandon a protocol before it has a chance to work. During phase 1, take half a teaspoon of cold-pressed black seed oil once daily in the morning, immediately before or alongside breakfast. Fat in the meal enhances thymoquinone absorption significantly because it is a fat-soluble compound. Do not take it on a completely empty stomach in the first week, as some individuals experience mild gastric sensitivity at the outset. The oil must be cold-pressed and unrefined. Heat processing during extraction degrades thymoquinone content substantially, and what remains in the bottle after heat processing is a fraction of what cold pressing preserves. Look for bottles that specify cold pressed on the label and are stored in dark glass, which protects the oil from the light-induced oxidative degradation that compromises shelf stability. Plastic containers and clear glass are signs of a product not optimized for thymoquinone preservation. During this first phase, begin tracking 3 things every morning before eating: your energy level upon waking, your mental clarity in the first hour of the day, and the intensity of your morning hunger. Write them down. These are indirect but reliable markers of overnight blood sugar stability, and you will want this baseline when you reach the midpoint of the protocol. Phase 2 runs from day 8 through day 14. This is the therapeutic phase, and it is where the receptor level work accelerates most significantly. Increase the dose to 1 teaspoon of cold-pressed black seed oil twice daily, once in the morning with breakfast and once in the evening with your last meal. The twice-daily dosing maintains more consistent thymoquinone levels in the bloodstream across the full 24-hour period, which matters because receptor expression is a continuous biological process that benefits from sustained compound availability rather than a single daily peak followed by trough. Research from the Journal of Diabetes and Metabolic Disorders used this twice-daily 1 teaspoon protocol for 8 weeks and found it produced a 45% reduction in fasting blood glucose and significant improvement in HOMA-IR scores, which is a standardized measurement of insulin resistance. During phase 2, add 1 dietary modification that compounds the receptor level work thymoquinone is initiating. With every meal during this phase, include a source of intact fiber, not a fiber supplement and not processed fiber, but whole vegetables, legumes, or intact whole grains. The synergy between thymoquinone's microbiome effects and dietary fiber creates compounding benefit for Akkermansia muciniphilia populations that neither intervention produces as effectively alone. Revisit the morning notes you began in phase 1. Many people begin noticing changes in morning energy and post-meal hunger stability between days 9 and 12. This is the early functional signal of improving insulin receptor efficiency, expressing itself in ways you can feel before it is visible in blood work. Phase 3 runs from day 15 through day 21. This is the consolidation phase. Maintain the twice daily 1 teaspoon dosing from phase 2 without reduction. During this final phase, add 2 supporting practices that extend and compound the receptor repair work thymoquinone has been initiating. The first is a 10-minute walk within 30 minutes of finishing your largest meal, not an hour later, within 30 minutes. Muscle contraction during the post-meal glucose window activates GLUT4 translocation through a pathway independent of insulin receptor signaling, moving glucose into muscle cells through a parallel route that reduces the total glucose load the repaired receptors must manage. The receptors are being repaired from within, while this parallel pathway provides immediate relief from without. The second supporting practice is 1 tablespoon of raw apple cider vinegar and water, consumed at the beginning of your 2 largest meals. Acetic acid inhibits the digestive enzymes that break complex carbohydrates into glucose, slowing the glucose curve, arriving at your improving receptors from above, while thymoquinone continues improving the receptors from below. The convergence of these 2 directions is what produces the kind of metabolic shift that shows up in blood work, and that most people using this protocol correctly begin to notice in their morning fasting numbers within the final days of the 21-day period. Give this protocol the consistency it requires. Cold-pressed black seed oil is available at most health food stores and online for between $10 and $20 for a month's supply. The post-meal walk costs nothing. The apple cider vinegar costs less than $2. The total investment for a 21-day protocol supported by decades of peer-reviewed human clinical research is under $25 and 60 seconds of daily preparation. What it requires is not money. It is the decision to use it every day for 3 weeks without interruption. 3,000 years of independent traditional recognition, decades of molecular biology confirming the mechanism, a head-to-head clinical trial against the world's most prescribed diabetes medication. The seed is tiny. What it does to your insulin receptors is not. Start tonight. Share this with someone who is managing blood sugar and has never heard of this yet. They're looking for exactly what you just found. I'm Dr. Stephen Moss. I'll see you in the next one.